Prepare to be illuminated.
Hi guys, Skypoint here. In this video, I'm going to be going through the different cards available to the Emperor's Children chapter in Horus Heresy Legions. As usual, we're going to start by taking a look at the Warlords first, and then we're going to go through the cards from the cheapest to the most expensive. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk about the mechanics of the Emperor's Children. So first of all, their unique mechanic is something called Perfection. What that means is that with many of their cards, you get a bonus effect, usually a buff to the stats, or it can be something else, if you spend all of your remaining energy in the turn playing that card. So we'll take a look as we go through the cards at exactly what those mechanics are, what those effects are. The second mechanic they have is sort of held in common with the Iron Hands, but the Emperor's Children do that better, and that is buffing. The Emperor's Children are really reliant on increasing the stats of their units or their warlord and turning them into almost unstoppable killing machines. So between the two of those effects, you're hoping to dominate and overcome your enemy and achieve victory. Alright, with that, let's take a look at their warlords. The Emperor's Children, in common with all other legions, have 4 warlords. Now, of these 4, you can consider 2 of them to be skill intensive, where your skill matters a lot and your luck matters a little. And the other 2 warlords are luck intensive, where your luck matters a lot, but your skill does still matter a little. We're going to start with the skill intensive ones. And so those are Saul Tarvitz and Lucius the Eternal. So let's begin with Saul. Saul is going to be the warlord you're most likely to get first from the Emperor's Children, because he's got the most common. He's got the green rarity. So let's take a look at his stats. In common with the green warlords, he has 2 attack and 30 health. 30 health is a little bit poor, but Saul Tarvitz can hold his weight all the way to the highest end of the Terra ladder, because of his special ability. It's a free ability, and it makes the next card you play during this turn cost 1 less. That lets Saul do 2 things. First of all, he can actually play ahead of the curve. So in his first turn, for example, he can play a unit which costs 3 energy. And the second thing which he can do is really take advantage of perfection. With Saul Tarvitz, you can get a broader range of cards to trigger their perfection value, because you're able to reduce the cost. So if you had 2 energy left in the turn, you can cut the cost of a 3 energy card down to 2 energy, and that'll actually trigger its perfection. So I said he's a skill intensive warlord because he can be very frustrating to play while you're still new at the game, and you don't really have a good sense of when the right time to make a card cheaper so you can play it this turn, or save the card so that you can play it with perfection or synchronize with another card better later on. So as you get better at the game, you're going to get better at using Saul Tarvitz, because you'll understand the situations you're in much better. So that's Saul Tarvitz. So essentially he's a little bit more forgiving than Lucius is, as we'll go on to in a moment, because with Saul, as I mentioned, it's easier to control when your perfections trigger. Alright. Lucius, on the other hand, is probably the single most skill-intensive warlord you can have. In the hands of an unskilled player with him, like me, Lucius will fail and lose almost every match. In the hands of a skilled player, he can dominate anyone in the game. So let's take a look at what Lucius does. So he is an orange rarity warlord, and he's one of the very few orange warlords who does not have 35 health. He only has 30 health. And he has 2 attack. Now let's look at his abilities. So first of all, he can spend 2 energy to gain +1 attack until the end of turn. And on top of that, he has this battle honor effect, meaning that if he kills a target, he can attack again. This allows Lucius to make many attacks in one turn, and this is where I, as well as other unskilled players, fall over, because we're going to overextend ourselves with Lucius, attacking too many things or attacking the wrong targets. And with only 30 health, he's very unforgiving. You have to know exactly what you're going to attack and plan your attacks perfectly with your other cards to make that work. He also has high initiative, meaning he's got a pretty good chance of going first, which he really needs with only 30 health. He's got to control the flow of the match. before we go on to the other two Warlords, the other thing which Lucius can do is he also, in common with Saul, can control when cards get played with perfection, because often you can bleed energy by using your ability to increase your attack and also set your remaining energy to be the perfect level to trigger one of your perfection effects. It's a little bit harder with him because you're spending 2 energy to do that, but it can be done as well. Lucius, just to round off, so Lucius is probably the single most skill-intensive warlord in the game. If you know what you're doing, you can be a menace to everyone. But if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to fall on your face all over the ladder. Alright, so those are the 2 skill-heavy warlords. Now let's take a look at the more luck-intensive warlords. We're going to start with Fabius Bile. He's also an orange rarity warlord like Lucius, but unlike Lucius, he does get the full 35 health and the 2 attack. Now Fabius's ability is for 2 energy, enhance a friendly troop. It does say enhance in quote marks. That's partly for lore reasons, but also because originally Fabius had a chance of buffing and also damaging in some way the units his buffs were being applied to, typically through stunning them. That's now been removed, so everything that Fabius does will give you a positive improvement to a unit. So why is he luck based? The problem is you don't know what that enhancement will be. Sometimes it's going to be a minor tweak, like I think a +1 attack or something like that. Sometimes it's going to make them devastating, like with +2 attack, +2 health, and with bloodthirsty, so they can attack twice. Because you don't know what you're going to get when you buff a unit with Fabius, it can be tricky because you don't know if that 2 energy is going to be worth it for what you need to do or not. So it's a bit of an unreliable effect. You don't know what you're going to get when you spend that 2 energy, and that's really why I don't like him. Alright. And then the final warlord is Fulcrum. So Fulcrum has medium initiative in common with Saul and Fabius. Like all the Primarchs, he has 40 health and 2 attack. He does have a Whisper of Chaos, we'll talk about that in a moment, and his energy ability is kind of interesting. You spend 2 energy to add a random Emperor's Children tactic to your hand. Now, there's 2 sides of this. The first is add an Emperor's Children tactic to your hand, because the Emperor's Children generally get some very nice, very powerful tactic cards. That's great. The problem with it is random. You don't know what you're going to get when you trigger this, and you're just hoping it's something which is going to end up being helpful to you. Sometimes it's going to help you dominate, like you get people who end up with 3 Pride of the Emperor cards in their hand, which is just lethal. Or you'll get a tactic which is not something you can use during the game. But still, it does help build your hand up in a game where making sure you've got cards to play is important. He can help you out with that. Now let's take a look at his Whisper of Chaos. So, if I were to go down to the bottom over here. So, we're going to first look at his Demon Prince form. This is mean. So, he's got 3 attack like all the Demon Princes. I guess Angron has 4, but Fulcrum has 3 attack. But here's his special ability. Spend 2 energy to steal 3 health. That means not only are you doing 3 damage to an enemy, you're healing yourself for 3 at the same time. That makes him extremely difficult to kill if he's turned into his Demon Prince form. Which brings me on to the problem. If he's turned into his Demon Prince form. Until a couple, well, really until last month, Demon Prince Fulcrum used to be relatively common to face because his ability was difficult but possible to trigger. Now, on the other hand, Fulcrum's ability is Fulcrum's demon form is almost impossible to achieve. Look at this. It's -1 cost when you play a tactic triggering perfection. Now, because perfection is triggered generally when you've used up all of your energy in the turn, his Whisper of Chaos, which costs 18 energy to begin with, needs to get reduced to 10 energy for you to activate it, which means you have to spend 8 turns triggering perfection, which is really tough to do, and you're unlikely to ever see it, because it's hard to get that many tactic cards which require perfection coming up at the right time. Ugh, it's a nightmare. So you're hardly ever going to see the Demon Prince Fulcrum anymore. So if you're playing Fulcrum, the main reason you're doing that is so that you have access to the Emperor's Children card pool, you've got 40 health, and you've got the ability to generate some random tactics. If you're incredibly lucky, the game might drag on long enough for you to actually trigger his demon form, but honestly, let me know if you do, because that's quite the achievement now. Alright, with the Warlords looked at, let's start going through card by card. First of all, Tactical Brilliance. This is one of the very few zero-cost cards in the game, and I believe it's the only zero-cost tactic, and it is fantastic. Tactical Brilliance can be used for 2 reasons. First of all, it always does reduce the cost of the next card you play by 2 during this turn. So the most obvious use for Tactical Brilliance is allowing you to play well ahead of the curve. In fact, if you're playing as Saul, you can use your ability after playing Tactical Brilliance to play a card at a discount of 3 energy, which can give you a huge advantage at the start of the game, because it means in your first turn you can play one of the unit cards which normally costs 5 energy and drop that in your first turn. And there's very few things which can destroy a 5 energy cost card in turn 1. The second reason this card is really great is sometimes you may have just triggered perfection by playing a tactic or a unit and using up all your remaining energy, but in your hand you have Tactical Brilliance and another unit or tactic which has perfection, which costs 2 energy. So after triggering perfection the first time round, you can play Tactical Brilliance, reduce the cost of a 2 energy card to 0 and play that, which will trigger perfection, because you've still used up your remaining energy in the turn. So it's the only way you can execute perfection twice in 1 turn. So it's a really good card, definitely needed if you're Saul Tarvitz, and really helpful if you're any of the other Emperor's Children Warlords. Alright, so that is Tactical Brilliance. Next up, Dar Moosian Squad. I don't like these guys at all. For 1 energy, their stats are actually pretty good, 1 attack and 3 health. The weird thing is their ability over here. Spend 1 energy to return to your hand. Which means, yeah, if they're taking damage or they have a debuff, you can clear it and put them back into your hand. But then essentially you're spending 2 energy to fix them up, which is 1 energy to return them to your hand and 1 energy to play again. The only thing these guys might be useful for is manipulating your energy pool for playing perfection. But honestly, there's so many other ways to do that that it's probably not worth including Dar Moosian Squad unless you're really out of options. Next, Diversionary Tactics. This is an interesting one. Stunning an enemy is always useful, so it's a pretty good card on that basis alone. It only costs 1 energy, which makes it cool. It also means that it's one of those other ways you can try to tweak your energy pool in order to make sure that you have the right remaining energy to execute perfection. But it's not that this is a bad card, it's just that the Emperor's Children deck is full of some really great cards. And although I encourage you to include Diversionary Tactics in your deck, you're probably going to find that there's going to be some other stuff you want to put in instead. So conclusion, this is actually a really great card, because of that stunning effect is always useful. Its cheap cost means you can use it to trigger perfection at the right time, but it just takes up room in your deck, and honestly I don't use this in any of my Emperor's Children card decks just because of the other cards I want to include instead. Alright, Andronius. I used to use this card a lot when I was playing Emperor's Children Rising Up the Ladder on the lower planets, partly because I didn't have too many other Emperor's Children cards, but then secondly because it deals both 2 damage, which can jam an enemy, and also, it deals 2 damage which can kill an enemy, and also it can jam them, removing their special abilities. That makes it pretty handy. It only has 2 downsides. First of all, that jamming ability only kicks in with perfection, meaning that another card really you'll only be able to do the jam and not trigger perfection on one of your own troops, which sort of makes you have to choose between jamming an enemy or triggering a perfection ability. But then the second problem with this card is it deals 2 damage to a troop only. You cannot use this against the enemy Warlord, which makes it a bit limited. So because of that, this is also a pretty decent card, but there are better ones out there, so I tend to not include this. Especially now that the Sabotage card, which is a jam effect, has been reduced in cost to 1 energy. That's usually better, I think. Alright, let's take a look at the next card. Volquez Squad. Alright, so this is one of the first of the 3 2-energy units that the Emperor's Children have, who trigger with Perfection. These guys get triggered and they start with a drop pod. That can be pretty handy because it means that, especially if you put these guys down in the first turn of the game, they're likely to survive until the second turn, and with 3 attack they can lay down the hurt. So it's a perfectly good card to include for 2 energy. Honestly, there's not a lot to choose from between the different 2 energy basic units of the Emperor's Children, so you can pick whichever of the 3 you like. I'm going to go over the other 2 energy troops and then go on to Concentrated Fire. So your next option for 2 energy is Wraitharian Platoon. So these guys go down, and their perfection ability is they draw a card. Now this helps you as Emperor's Children for 2 reasons. First of all, drawing a card helps pretty much everyone because having options is always good. But then the other thing is, by drawing a card for Emperor's Children, it allows you to have more options in how you spend your energy in the next turn, so that you can trigger perfection. What I mean by that is, let's say if in your hand you have a card which costs 3 energy, and you're coming up to a 5 energy turn. So your card needs to spend 3 energy in order to trigger perfection. You're going to have 5 energy in your next turn, and you have 2 energy remaining now. If you play Wraitharian Platoon and you trigger its perfection and you draw a card, you might draw a card which costs 6 energy and therefore would not have helped you with perfection. But then the next card behind that in your deck was a 2 energy card, which would help you spend 2 energy and then 3 energy on your perfection troop to activate its ability. So if you didn't have Wraitharian Platoon, in your next turn you would have drawn like the 6 energy card. By playing Wraitharian Platoon and triggering its perfection, you will have been effectively drawn 2 cards and been more likely to get the right blend of cards to trigger your perfection ability. I know that sounds a little bit complicated, but once you start playing with Emperor's Children, you realize how important it is to have the right cards in your hand to activate the right perfection at the right time. Alright, and the final 2 energy unit, and my personal favorite, is Savoring Squad. So they gain +1/+1. I tend to like these guys more because I just feel more comfortable having someone with 3 health around, but honestly the net effect is very close to Volquez Squad, and it makes almost no difference which of those you get, because essentially Savoring Squad will need 3 damage to kill. Volquez Squad, I guess they'll need 4 damage to kill, so really honestly Volquez Squad is better. I don't know why I've been including Savoring Squad all this time. Anyway, so those are the 3 2 energy troops, and so rounding off 2 energy for Emperor's Children is Concentrated Fire. This one is generally least important for Saul, because with only 30 health and low attack, you're generally not trying to attack directly with Saul. It can help Fulcrum and Fabius Bile, but this card is mostly there for Lucius. Lucius can become a beast with Concentrated Fire if he's got a couple of units on the field. It's +1, it gives bonus to your Warlord, is for each friendly unit, and your Warlord acts as a unit himself. So if you're playing Lucius and you begin a turn and you have 6 energy, and you have 2 troops in play as well as Lucius, you can play Concentrated Fire to boost his attack by +3. 1 for Lucius, 1 for the first troop, 1 for the second troop. That still leaves you with 4 energy, which you can use with Lucius to increase his attack by another 2. So Lucius would go up to 7 attack in that turn, and be able to keep attacking repeatedly as long as he's killing things. So this card becomes really great for Lucius, and you need to have it in a Lucius deck. Alright, next up, Aceton Squad. These guys are boring but safe and reliable. With For a 3 energy card, their stats are pretty decent. 3 attack, 4 health, so it's relatively hard to kill them, but their energy ability is great. You spend 2 energy and they deal 2 damage and do not take any damage in return. That's really valuable, so these are a pretty solid choice for including in many decks. It just opens up your options on what to do. Next up, Erewhon. This is not a card worth using just because the right circumstances to fully benefit from it are tricky to get. So return a friendly troop to your hand. This is usually good to do when the troop has a negative effect on it, or the troop is damaged, or the troop had a really great rally ability and you want to use that ability again later on. A great example of that is on Ambassador Melgator, who costs 2 energy and returns an enemy troop to his hand. If you use Erewhon on Ambassador Melgator, he gets returned to your hand so you can use him again, and his cost gets reduced by 2, so he becomes a free unit. The problem with this is this tactic costs a lot, 3 energy, although I guess it's discounting another unit by 2 later on if you trigger its perfection. But again, if you trigger its perfection during a turn, you're very unlikely to be triggering another perfection in the same turn. And there's so many good perfection effects for Emperor's Children that you probably want one of those instead. So because of that, Erewhon is not a great card because the opportunity cost of playing it is too high. Next, for the Emperor. This is an interesting one. This card becomes really worth it when you have a big hand of cards in your when you're holding on to a big hand of cards. Because of that, although I see it used quite a fair bit, I think it's being generated by Fulcrum when I see it being used, as opposed to people planning on including it from the start. It's kind of situational because you really only use it if you have a big hand, and for someone like Saul, for example, because of his ability to make cards cheaper, quite a lot of the times you're emptying out your hand quite quickly, and so for the Emperor it doesn't really help. So I think this card is not super important to include, and you may want to think about taking it out of your deck. Hall of Rites. This is great. This is a fantastic card which needs to go in. As I mentioned, Emperor's Children are all about buffing their, are heavily reliant on buffing their troops, and Hall of Rites is a great way to do that. While this card is alive, non-demon troops you play gain a Mark of Chaos as soon as you put them in play. And that can often be a huge advantage, especially if it's a Mark of Khorne or a Mark of Slaanesh. Secondly, Hall of Rites has 5 health, which makes it quite resilient and tricky to remove, and yet it's a priority target, which means you can play Hall of Rites, and while it's still alive, it's going to be soaking up hits which will be going on your other units or your Warlord, and it's buffing the units you put in play. So this is great. You need to include Hall of Rites in your deck. Longinus Squad. These guys are okay. Their stats are fine, 4 attack. Their health was on a low side, but kind of still okay at 3 health. The main problem with them is their perfection ability is underwhelming compared to other units, so they tend to be bypassed. So they gain unstoppable, meaning frontline doesn't affect them, but that's a relatively poor advantage, especially given their low health, because they can't attack in the turn they're deployed, and because they have unstoppable, they become a pretty high priority target, and at 3 health they're quite easy to kill. So they're usually not worth it. There's better cards for Emperor's Children. Peak Condition. This is actually one of the less popular buffs, because Peak Condition will only buff a single one of your troops, and it only buffs them if the buffs only really become super powerful if there's lots of enemies, which is getting kind of situational. It's not one which is great to do, and there are better buffing cards available to Emperor's Children, so I would suggest you do not include Peak Condition. At 3 energy, Hall of Rites I personally find is better. Tiberylon bikes. These guys are great, especially if you can somehow keep them alive. For Fabius Bile, these are one of the prime units you want to include and buff, because even 1 bonus point of health will give these guys much more survivability than they otherwise would have had. And for most of the other Warlords, this unit is worth playing for 3 energy because it's going to soak up the attention from the enemy Warlord. Because they will want to kill this thing before it gets to attack, because it has sneak attack. It can keep attacking until it dies, basically, because it doesn't take any damage while attacking. Unbreakable Focus. This is one of those cards which make the Emperor's Children so powerful. Whenever you play this, you get your troops gain +1 attack and +1 health. But if you trigger the perfection on it, which is not that hard to do, especially for Saul, your troops gain an additional +1 attack and health for a total buff of +2. Especially as you start getting into stacking up some of their buffs, this can make your troops really mean and difficult to take out. So definitely include Unbreakable Focus. It's a great card. Especially, sorry, just to add this, if you ever at a point where you have 2 or 3 troops in play and then you play Unbreakable Focus, your enemy's heart will sink. Discipline. This card is really unpopular. It's probably one of the worst cards in the game. First of all, it's an expensive heal at 4 energy, but it heals 1 to your Warlord per enemy on the board. Meaning at the worst case scenario, you're going to spend 4 energy and heal 1 point. In the best case scenario, you spend 4 energy and you heal 7 points because there's an enemy Warlord and 6 troops out there. But if that's happening, you're going to heal 7 points and take way more than that when your enemy hits you in the next turn. So you're probably not going to get helped by the healing out of this card. The perfection as well is really niche. Like, it only really is helpful if you've got 1 or more troops out there, while the enemy has enough troops for to trigger a decent amount of healing. It's all messy. So it's really bad. Do not use Discipline in your deck. Eidolon Squad. This is one of the staples of an Emperor's Children deck. It has one of the most useful perfection abilities, which is Stun. Typically, you're going to play this and stun the enemy Warlord, but sometimes you're going to play this card and you're going to stun a powerful unit of the enemy or an annoying unit of the enemy. It can help swing the tempo of the game in your favor. Eidolon Squad, definitely 2 thumbs up. Keep it in your deck. Hold at all costs. This is one of those cards which I like to include in my deck. At the very least, it refills your energy, so you can play more cards than normal. So that's most useful in the late game. And in the very best case scenario, if you manage to play your cards perfectly, and this is where I said that often Emperor's Children requires a fair bit of skill and luck. If you empty out your hand by playing Hold at all costs and it uses up all your remaining energy, you get to refill your energy and draw 5 new cards, which can give you a huge advantage. So it can be great. It can be a huge game changer. It just needs skill and luck to play. And although I'd always love to believe I can pull this off, and I include Hold at all costs in my deck, I've only triggered its perfection once. But the effect was so dramatic that I keep including it in my deck, and I live in hope that I can make it work. Warlords Squad. These guys are subpar only because their ability is so situational. It sounds great, gain +1 if you for each of your friendly Space Marine troops when you deploy them. But the problem is the Emperor's Children have some incredibly great vehicle cards as well. And a lot of the times you're going to have a fair number of vehicles and not enough Space Marines on the board to really benefit from this card. So at 4 energy, there's better ones. So I recommend against including this. Longinus. This is included in every single Emperor's Children deck. It's a direct damage tactic. Doing 3 damage is often enough to kill many targets on the board. If there's no enemy troops to spend this on the board, well, you can hit the enemy Warlord instead. But if the enemy troop dies, you draw 2 cards. So this can help you to keep your hand full of options on what to handle in future turns. So it's great, and your Emperor's Children deck needs to include Longinus. Mycelis jet bikes. These are also a fantastic and powerful unit which should be included. What makes these guys so good is actually their perfection. So generally you don't want to play this card unless you're playing it to trigger perfection. But when you do, it's great. It's a fast unit with 5 damage, making it one of the most damaging fast units in the game. So this is really important in pretty much every Emperor's Children deck, so include it, it's worth it. Actually, on that note, sorry, the one Emperor's Children Warlord who might not use these guys would be Fabius Bile, and that's only because you can't trigger their perfection and still manage to buff them before they attack. So it's slightly less useful for Fabius, although honestly at 5 attack, even without a buff, they're pretty great. Odovoker. This is the main frontline unit you're going to see Emperor's Children relying on. So it has pretty solid stats for 4 energy anyway, 3 attack, 5 health. If you put them in play, you really want to do it at a time where you can trigger the perfection so that they can get frontline as well. And then after that, what's actually handy about these guys is usually you don't want to attack too much with your frontline units because that means they're taking damage, which makes them able to soak up less attacks during the enemy turn. But unlike most other frontline units who therefore just sit passive during their turn, Odovokar can buff a friendly troop during your turn. So he can just be sitting there buffing things until he dies. So it's pretty good, and most Emperor's Children decks will include Odovokar with good reason. Next up, Ruined Palace. On the initial thoughts, this is a decent card because it gives you Space Marine troops a Mark of Chaos, and if you do it with perfection, it also buffs them, which sounds fantastic. The only problem is, as I've mentioned before, the Emperor's Children have some great vehicles. We just saw that already with the Eidolon bikes and the Mycellus jet bikes, and this card will do nothing for those vehicles if they're in play. So because of that, because of the fact that you really want to include many of the Emperor's Children vehicles, you're rarely going to get a huge amount of benefit out of Ruined Palace, so I don't recommend putting this one in your deck. Chaplin Charmers. This guy is kind of cool. He gives all of your non-demon troops, that does include vehicles, a Mark of Chaos when he dies. Honestly, he's a pretty average guy because of that. So he's got his stats are completely average for 5 energy. The main reason I don't like him is that if you have no other units in play when he dies, his ability did nothing. So he's a situational unit, and I rarely like situational units, so I don't tend to include him in my deck. Volquez Squad. This guy looks great from his attack. For 5 energy, you get a unit with 6 attack, a great battle honor ability. Whenever you kill a unit, as long as he has survived, you get to draw a card. If he dies while attacking, that does not it does not trigger even if he kills an enemy unit. But the main problem he has is at only 4 health, coming in at 5 energy, there's a lot of ways the enemy can kill a 4 health unit, and with 6 attack, he's a super high priority, and he's almost certainly going to get killed before he does anything. So I think you shouldn't include him. Because the other thing is, at 5 energy, there's a much better unit coming up with 4 health, which is Noise Marine. Let's take a look at him. So he only has 5 attack and 4 health, but read his ability. When he attacks, he stuns both the target as well as adjacent units. So you have a pretty good chance, if the enemy only has like 1 or 2 units in play and they're next to his Warlord, you can attack the enemy Warlord, do 5 damage to him, and then stun the Warlord and both of his other units. Noise Marines is great. I think include it. Just the one watch out is, because they're so good and because they have 4 health, be prepared for the enemy to try to prioritize killing them. Fabius Bile can help these guys out a little bit by trying to play a buff on them, and if you're lucky they get like a +2 health and become much tougher to deal with. But if they survive to your next turn, they can really make a big difference in the game for you. Serious Rhino. This card tended to get used a fair bit earlier in the ladder. You don't tend to see it that often late in the ladder. At 5 energy, it has a relatively low attack value. It does have good health, 6 health, but if you have it in play, you're not going to be using it to attack. You're going to be using it for its special ability, which is to make your next Astartes this turn cost 2 less. again, this can help you in 3 ways. You can get ahead of the energy curve by playing a more powerful unit early. You can use this to adjust the cost of units more to trigger your perfection abilities. Or the third thing you can do with this card is if you've already played perfection and so you've got 0 energy left, but you have a Space Marine who has a perfection ability, and the Space Marine costs 2 energy, you can trigger Sirius Rhino and reduce the cost of that Marine to 0, and that way trigger the perfection when you play him. So it gives you a couple of options. I think it just doesn't get used that much on late Terra because there's too many things out there which can kill a 6 health unit at 5 energy. So they tend to get blasted away quite quickly. Alright, Agnomen. This one is really important for Emperor's Children. It's only a green rarity, which is supposed to be like one of the most common cards, but its perfection ability is fantastic. 4 damage to the enemy Warlord when you put it in play, as well as 7 attack, so when it attacks afterwards it does a ton of damage. 5 health gives it respectable sticking power, although 1 crack grenade card can destroy it. But even if it gets destroyed quickly, at the very least, hopefully you played this by triggering perfection, so you spent 6 energy to deal 4 damage to enemy Warlord, which is an okay-ish trade-off. Ideally you want this guy to survive at least 1 turn, so you can do some damage with it too. But it's a great card, you need to include 2 of these, and play them when you trigger its perfection. Enhanced Warrior. This card is kind of rarer to use. You get your full value out of this guy when you have him in your hand at the beginning, and lots of enemies are getting killed by the time you reach the 6 energy turn and you can play him. He's much less useful if you draw him late in the game. Because of that, because of the fact he's so situational, I don't like to use him because you're hoping for everything to come together in the right way for you to play Enhanced Warriors to its full benefit. So I say you leave this card out of your deck. Perfection's Flight is really important for Emperor's Children because it's their instant unit kill. No matter how well protected the enemy unit is, if you can target it with Perfection's Flight, it will be destroyed. And if you trigger Perfection as an extra bonus, you get to draw a card. You need this in there. There's going to be many super tough or super high health or difficult or problematic units the enemy will play. Perfection's Flight makes your troubles go away. Include it. Rylan. This is a legendary card, and he's a pretty good one. He's relatively cheap for a legendary, coming in at 6 energy. His attack value is really poor for that cost. He's only got 4 attack, but he has a decent amount of health. He does have shield, meaning he can absorb the first hit on him without anything happening. But what you're really into him for is perfection. When a friendly troop triggers perfection, give it +2 attack and +2 health. And this stacks with other effects. So this can quickly help to turn your units into unstoppable killer beasts with really high stats. So I always try to include Rylan when I can. Corrupted Battleship. I don't like this because, again, it's kind of situational. The card is cheapest when there's lots of enemy troops in play, but a lot of the times at that time it's difficult to kill enough stuff with 2 damage. On the other hand, often this will mess up the day of somebody who plays Ornitov's Barge but draws a bunch of relatively low health units out of that, and then you can play Corrupted Battleship and just wipe them all out in response. So it's kind of situational on its use, and as you can tell, I don't like situational cards. I like cards which are reliable. I know that they're likely to get used in the game, and I know that what they're going to give me for that. So I don't tend to include Corrupted Battleship. Pride of the Emperor, on the other hand, is essential. This is the Emperor's Children kill card, where you bring the enemy Warlord down to 7 health, and then you whack them with Pride of the Emperor and you kill them. Or if this is happening late in the game and you've got a pretty good chance of drawing Pride of the Emperor again soon, you can play it with Perfection and send it back to your deck, and then it comes back later on at a cheaper cost. Great card, definitely put it in your deck. It's one of your main kill conditions. Sardairon. These guys are okay. For 7 energy, they've got average stats. 6 attack, which is a little low. 8 health, which is slightly higher than average. What's interesting with them is their battle honor ability. If they attack a target and kill it, they gain shield, meaning they can soak up the next hit on them. What I personally tend to find though is that even if they get their shield up, the enemy will use a cheap unit or a cheap tactic to knock down the shield and then hit them with a more expensive, more powerful unit. So it ends up being a mild inconvenience rather than a problem for your enemy Warlord. So because of that, I don't tend to put Sardaron into my decks. At 7 energy, Thodorian on the other hand is a different matter. This guy is great, especially for Saul, who can play him during the 6 energy turn and trigger perfection, because although 6 attack, 6 health is poor for 7 energy, if you trigger perfection and he turns into 8 attack, 8 health, that becomes very good for 7 energy. So totally worth including Thodorian in your deck. And what's really awesome about this is it stacks. So if you have Rylan in play and then you follow Rylan up with Thodorian, well, Thodorian then gains +2 from his own perfection as well as +2 from Rylan. So for 7 energy you gained a unit with 10 attack and 10 health. That's pretty awesome. And I've managed to get that to happen a lot of times. So Thodorian is a must include in my decks. Eidolon is the next legendary. In theory, he's great. He's got 8. He costs 8 energy, but he's got 9 attack and 9 health, so he sticks around a lot. And when he attacks a target, he stuns it, so he can finish it off again later on. The main problem with Eidolon is by the time he comes out, there's usually quite a fair bit of removal cards available. So I would rather have 2 cheaper cards which have good secondary abilities or which have good perfection abilities going on between them than one single Eidolon who might be wiped out quickly. On the other hand, there are going to be times if you have him in your deck where you'll use him and he's just awesome. He knocks out or cripples something essential and then helps you to really win the match. Hammer of Justice. You rarely see this except at low levels in the ladder. Its stats are entirely average for 8 energy, and its special ability is kind of underwhelming. It basically picks on weak units, but it costs a lot of energy for that. So I think don't bother putting this in. There's just too many better things you can do with 8 energy than play something like this. The Iron Column is similarly problematic. Although it looks decent at first, it costs 9 energy, it's got 10 health, it's got 9 attack. You're rarely going to do much with its battle honor because it sounds good to gain a Mark of Chaos, but often by the time this guy comes out, you're going to be using it to attack a high damage or high health enemy, a powerful enemy unit. And at that point, it's not going to live for long with its Mark of Chaos after taking part in a combat against a powerful enemy. So the Iron Column rarely gets used. If you have it, you're in it just more for the 9 attack than for its special ability. But it's not that great for 9 energy. Alright, and the final card we're looking at is Subjugator Titan. This looks OP as hell at first. It costs 10 energy. It has 10 attack, 10 health, so it does a lot of damage. It's hard to kill. It has shield, so it soaks up the first hit on it. And on top of that, it has cleave 10, so it does 10 damage to the target to the left of what you hit, and 10 damage to the target to the right of what you hit. Meaning in total, every time Subjugator Titan attacks, it does 30 damage. So that sounds like it's a card that should dominate the game, right? Well, the problem is it's coming in at 10 energy, meaning there's a lot of other stuff already in play, which can be very dangerous. It also is a vehicle, meaning there's a couple of cards which can really mess up its day. But most of all, you can't do anything else in the turn. You can't play any other cards really in the turn you put down Subjugator Titan. So it sounds really powerful, but there's usually ways to deal with it by the time it comes into play. The one extra point about it though is Saul Tarvitz can do something really nasty. If you have Subjugator Titan in your hand, you can play it during your 7 energy turn, by using Tactical Genius to reduce its cost by 2 energy. So that's the 0 energy tactic we saw at the start. And then use Saul's ability to cut this thing down to 7 energy and then put it into play. And if your enemy does not have a good removal card in hand at that time, and he doesn't have a decent stun or anything like that, then this guy will help you to just really own your enemy for the next couple of turns. Alright, so that's a talk through the Emperor's Children cards. Hope you guys found this useful. Hopefully my next video will then be, at long last, my Fabius Bile review. Well, Fabius Bile deck building guide. In the meantime though, if you found this useful, please remember to subscribe to this channel, and you'll get notified when I post new content. And yeah, go ahead and try building your own Emperor's Children's decks, and hope you achieve perfection. Alright, so until the next video, bye guys.